So this is from Bernard Lafayette Jr. As the sun set, a mob began to gather around the church. As the crowd grew in number, eventually as many as 3,000 people appeared. It also grew in vitriol and hostility. The crowd began hurling rocks and bricks through the stained glass windows, and tear gas drifted through the sanctuary, while outside people flipped over cars and set them on fire. Inside, Dr. King tried to reach Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy to request federal protection. All of us gathered in the church were uncertain about our safety. I certainly felt in danger. Many feared that the church would be bombed. After all, not only had Dr. King's house been bombed with his wife, child, and a family friend inside during the 1956 bus boycott, but the very church we were gathered in had been bombed in 1957. There was little we could do but wait and pray to Jesus. We sat in the church and sang freedom songs and hymns that strengthened our spirits and soothed our fears. Occasionally, I took a deep breath to get a little relief from the pain in my fractured ribs from the beating I had endured earlier. At times, I wondered whether it would be better to be safe in jail or to be there in the church, surrounded by a vicious mob. There we go. Eventually, Dr. King announced that he had a special mission for which he needed volunteers. The main qualification, Dr. King said, was a commitment to nonviolence. He didn't need hotheads or people overcome by anger. Needless to say, no one rushed to the pulpit. After my experience at the bus station, I didn't feel I could handle another mob, so I held back too. However, around 10 or 12 people eventually did volunteer for the mission, which Dr. King then explained. Reports had come in over the phone that a group of black men led by armed cab drivers were mobilizing at a nearby service station with plans to attack the mob and rescue the people trapped in the church. Some of them, no doubt, had relatives and friends inside the church. You see, black cab drivers were an important part of the local civil rights movement in Montgomery. They had helped out in the carpooling efforts during the boycott. And when the boycott ended, some of them formed their own cab companies to serve black customers. But they were more than just drivers. They saw themselves as part of a security force as they moved passengers around the segregated city. Some of these men were war veterans. Some were experienced hunters, and were probably more experienced with their weapons than their white antagonists. Had these men attacked the mob surrounding the church, the story of the Freedom Rides would have had a much different ending. Dr. King's mission then was to persuade the cab drivers to abandon their rescue attempts, to lay down their weapons and go home. His small group gathered at the front door of the church, lined up in twos. Then they walked out the doors as if they were marching. There was an unforgettable silence as they passed out of the church. We watched as they walked through the howling crowd. I was sure I would never see them again. And yet, for all the yelling, the mob didn't touch them. Such is the power of nonviolence. About an hour passed. Suddenly, out of the darkness, they all reappeared unharmed. Dr. King had convinced the cab drivers to abandon their mission. This was no small miracle. Dr. King showed through his act of courage in this most harrowing moment of the campaign that fear was not a factor for him. It was, at that point in the Freedom Rides, the greatest lesson he could have offered. Early the next morning, with the help of the Alabama National Guard, which arrived after hours of pressure from Mr. Kennedy on the Alabama governor, John Malcolm Patterson, we were able to leave the church unharmed. Dr. King's courageous mission to our would-be rescuers prevented great bloodshed and kept the Freedom Rides on its nonviolent course. And it showed us what the Freedom Rides and the overall movement was really about.